Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to tonight's lecture about the Cork region in Engineers Ireland. Tonight's topic is construction and demolition waste in Ireland, an update and some of the recent legislative changes and procedure changes that are we're all experiencing in the industry. Just a bit of housekeeping. You've got mobile phones, you might turn them off, please, or put them on silent. And I think you all know where the entrance and exits are in case of emergency. Tonight's speaker is Warren Phelan, who's Technical Director in RPS. He's a chartered engineer and a chartered waste manager. He's got over 20 years experience in the waste field and has worked with many clients, both public and private, including the European Commission as the waste management and circular economy expert and on the European Green Capital and Green Leaf projects. He's worked for the CIF and the regional waste management offices as well, so he's got a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I'm looking forward to the talk that Warren's going to give. So Warren, if you'd like to step up to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan, and good evening, everybody. So in today's presentation, I've tried to take a broad look at where we're at in terms of construction, demolition, waste, where we're at, looking at the change that has happened in the market, our current capacity indigenously, recent developments that's happened that I think all of us in terms of engineers, contractors, clients all need to be aware of, and the implications of those, and there's more coming this year. And then really to finish off some bigger, sort of higher level in terms of the direction we're actually headed because of the, I suppose, the new policy and legislative agenda that's very much we're dealing with in terms of climate and sustainable development goals and really the direction of travel that we're going to find ourselves on. So to start off, I just wanted to give some context about the construction market. We've had very strong market conditions now for the last number of years. It was timely this morning that on Morning Ireland we had commentary in relation to the predicted growth for 2020, which again is in double digits, estimated to be at 10% for the construction sector, following on nearly 20% forecast for 2019. So, and the outlook still remains strong for the next, I suppose, the short to medium term, notwithstanding none of us have a crystal ball, but certainly in terms of the infrastructure that needs to develop within Ireland to ensure that economic prosperity continues. We're obviously able to provide for the population growth that's anticipated as well. We certainly need to continue and maintain the development of our infrastructure in Ireland. So what was interesting in the little piece that this morning though was that of those surveyed in relation to the construction sector, 60% of them identified climate change as critical to actually their business and addressing climate change. And whereas last year the main message was all about resources and the supply of resources and workforce, that's still an issue, but this is now really level pegging with that and maybe actually starting to trump it. So as I touched on there, we're in, I suppose, a development cycle now. We have Project 2040, which is a 20-year, I suppose, horizon from where we're at the moment. If we look more, I suppose, short to medium term over the next 10 years, we've over 100 billion of expenditure forecast and estimated to develop our infrastructure. Everything from housing, the current target, if you like, is up to 30,000 homes a year. We're well short that currently at the moment. We've major public transport projects such as Metro North, Dart expansion, bus connects across our cities. We have significant expansion of our interurban motorways, which a lot of schemes have been, I suppose, tendered in the last 12 to 18 months, starting off in phase one, and they have to go through a long life cycle before they get onto site. But that is actually commencing now. We've airport and port developments targeted, big expansion expected at Dublin Airport over the next 5 years and the following 5 years after that. We've got institutional programs in terms of educational and the health sector, upgrading of existing hospitals, new primary care centres, and then Irish Water's investment programme, I suppose, is going into its next cycle as well. So a whole range of infrastructure that is needed by the country for it to continue its prosperity and development. And certainly that has pressure points that are going to apply in our current market, and not least in terms of waste management is there, and how we deal with waste. We certainly have to shift our thinking so that waste is no longer seen as an end of pipe issue that we deal with, at the construction site. It's certainly something that has to move right up into upstream thinking, and it's in the context of our wider, climate goals in terms of we want to be climate neutral. That's the ambition by 2050. But the reality is, what does that actually mean for us on sites, involved in projects? And I think part of it is understanding what that challenge is and how we actually move and make that transition, so that we're moving away from a kind of maybe traditional, more linear approach to our projects and project development into something that values the materials that we actually use and starts to try and recirculate them and bring them into reuse. So two headline statistics that I wanted to kind of just start the presentation off with, that in terms of global climate emissions, 62% of those actually come from the extraction, processing and manufacturing of goods and materials. So when we look at actually climate emissions, we often talk about the energy sector, and we kind of silo these sectors in there. One thing about construction is very difficult, and material use within construction, because it just cuts across so many different sectors. It's actually kind of quite difficult to actually package that up and say what is coming from that particular sector. Another statistics from the same report that was released about 2 years ago was that the construction and maintenance of all the built environment consumes 50% of all materials entering the global economy, and generates 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. So greenhouse gas emissions, often there's an over-focus in terms of energy. But in fact, it's actually the material and resource use that we really need to start applying a fresh approach, a fresh thinking, because there's huge impacts from this sector, and there's actually huge savings and opportunities to be achieved as well. So what I thought I'd start off with, and I've broken the presentation down into a number of sections, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of those each ones, because I'm touching on a variety of issues, so happy to do that if a question comes to mind. What I thought we'd just have a quick look at the profile of construction and demolition waste in Ireland. We're obviously counting these things at the end of, as they come into the system as waste. What we're showing there in the graph is really the profile from 2004 up to 2018. That's the latest data that's available. And you can see, obviously, right at the peak of the Celtic Tiger before the crash, it was the largest waste stream the country was handling at nearly 18 million tonnes. We're well short of that, fell to obviously the low of just over 2 million tonnes in the recession. But we've had strong growth in the last number of years, and it's important to emphasize that how quickly construction waste can become an issue. It can jump quite significantly from one year to the others. In fact, it's probably the fastest growing waste stream we have in the country at the moment. So in the last number of years, you can see that it can grow easily over 20-30% from one year to the next. And we're expecting similar kind of growth patterns to continue for the next 10 years, aligned with the big development cycles that we're in at the moment. So recently I was involved in some work which was trying to project forward about what will the size of the ball of waste that we're actually going to be dealing with by the end of, let's say, the current development cycle. And we're looking up to 9 to 10 million tonnes. That's what we're estimating conservatively, using conservatively output factors from the construction sector based on the current data that we currently have. And of that nearly 10 million tonnes, the vast majority of it ends up being of soil and stone type material. A material that's generally very consistent and very reusable. Just sort of graph just to break down construction and demolition waste. When we talk about it, what do we actually mean? So we've mentioned soil and stone. That's one particular element of it. That's the inert element, if you like, the non-hazardous inert element. So that's shown there on the right-hand side of the screen. We have hazardous components, hazardous soils typically. We have non-hazardous, non-inert, which is an expression that you'll become more familiar with, essentially lightly contaminated material that's not hazardous, but it's not inert either. So it needs a particular type of solution to it, typically from brownfield sites that you'd find this type of material. We're expecting a strong growth within that. And a lot of this is designed by what the policy, if you take the planning framework for 2040, which is looking at our urban centres, and it's targeting 40 to 50% growth within the current footprint of these urban centres. So building more compactly, more densely, and connecting these urban centres together. That means excavations of a lot of contaminated ground potentially, and that poses its own challenges to those particular projects. And understanding the material that we have and what the management solutions are for those is very important. We've estimated there what concrete is, and we've also shown them other mixed C&D. So that's broadly some of the constituent parts of construction and demolition waste. I also wanted to just show you here in terms of profile is the issue of byproducts. So some of you are probably familiar with that particular term. So this is a term that's going to become increasingly more common within the construction industry in terms of handling of soil and stone type material. So when we're able to classify material as a byproduct, it changes from being a waste to essentially a resource and falls outside the waste legislation. So it can be handled completely different. So byproducts previously, or it was always a process, and we now have a new process in place for the handling of byproducts and for the authorization of that. And I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail. I wanted to show you some of the data here because you can see there has been a complete increase in the terms of applications for byproduct status on material. And I expect this trend is going to continue. And one thing is important here that these numbers represent the numbers that are notified to the EPA, not necessarily material that actually was ultimately approved. So we still don't have that particular data. So construction and demolition waste is going to get increasingly difficult to try and predict because byproducts are going to be an increasingly important element of it, but we don't know the significance of them quite yet. So in terms of data and what we're seeing in the information, it's growing strongly. Soil waste is the largest component of construction and demolition waste. The impact of byproducts, as I mentioned, is certainly it's going to be there. It's going to become more important in terms of the profile of this particular waste stream, but it's the information around it is uncertain at the moment. And it's certainly whether byproducts actually go through the system and are improved by the Environmental Protection Agency is certainly unknown. So we're still predicting strong growth. So we're currently at about 5 million tonnes, and we're looking at a growth up to nearly 10 million tonnes in the next decade. So it's certainly going to be a problem that Ireland has to face. We have to have the facilities there to actually deal with this material, but also it should be triggering us to start thinking about how can we actually put what is a quite reusable and recyclable material to actually more beneficial and economic applications. So Project 2040, as I mentioned, will remain a strong driver. And what's equally important in all of this is that we do have the numbers and the data to be able to look at the analysis and look at the trends and see where the gaps are. So taking that on then in terms of capacity, this pie chart here just shows a breakdown of collected waste, construction and demolition waste as reported by the EPA. It gives you a sense of the constituent parts that are being collected. Okay, the dominant element is soil and stone at 81% of it. Metals 4%, mixed C&D coming from your mixed skips 8%, concrete, bricks, tiles 7%, and the rest quite small numbers. So it is an area that is significantly characterized by soil and stone, which presents opportunities because that material is very reusable, and we need to start thinking of it in that way. So what are currently the options for you in terms of managing construction and demolition waste? So if we look at it in terms of recycling, and when I talk about recycling, I talk about waste going to a process, that process turning that material into a new product. We have limited amount of that going on in Ireland. Obvious examples would be in the kind of the gypsum area and the wood. But we have actually quite a limited amount of indigenous recycling happening for construction materials, and also in generally just for waste materials. In terms of processing, so we see a lot of mixed skips out in the sites at the moment. Typically these kind of mixed skips would go to waste facilities where they are processed. This is not necessarily recycling. That's one important thing. It usually gets sorted and there's segregation and there's separation of the mixed waste into individual fractions. That material leaves the facility still as waste. So that is a difference between the recycling element and this actual waste processing. That needs further treatment elsewhere. We have disposal options. We have inert landfills. So inert landfills are different to your municipal landfills, which typically your general household waste might end up in. Your inert landfills are clay lined typically, and they're there really to take specific construction soil kind of material. So the stuff I mentioned earlier on in terms of lightly contaminated, non-hazardous, non-inert, typically they would go then to an inert landfill facility once it fits within the waste acceptance criteria of that particular landfill. We have municipal landfills which are geotextile lined. So previously we were having this conversation 10 years ago, an awful lot of construction waste would have gone to landfill for use of capping, haul roads, various uses around the site, daily cover, etc. So that avenue, if you like, for management of material has more or less closed down completely. We now only really have 3 operational landfills in the country, and the need for soil waste just isn't there anymore. This area in terms of backfilling and land restoration has been a strong growth area, and we see that growing now for the next number of years. So this is really unlined facilities that accept inert soil waste. I'll go into them now in more detail shortly. So export is obviously another option for us in terms of material. So this is something that we don't like to necessarily see. We should be able to try and deal with as much of our resources as possible. So this is for our contaminated materials or contaminated waste, where simply we have no facility or no avenue in Ireland to actually deal with this material, so it has to end up being exported. Similarly, certain recyclables, such as metals and plastics, we export an awful lot of these materials as well. So to look quickly at our landfill options, so I've mentioned there that we have 2 inert landfills. We only have 2 of these in the country at the moment, so these are clay lined. They're both principally based in the Eastern Midlands region, one in Kildare and one in Fingal, in the north of Dublin, Fingal County Council. So they accept, as I said, non-hazardous, non-inert waste material, so waste from brownfield sites that fits within that waste acceptance criteria. So this would be the higher cost of this type of material, maybe up to €20 per tonne. And it's certainly an area that we have to keep an eye on, because with the push on development within the current urban footprints, we're going to see more of this material actually being generated. And it can't go to other sites that we're sending general soil waste to at the moment. We mentioned there with 3 municipal landfills. So really the move away in Ireland in terms of waste management, moving away from landfills, moving up the hierarchy, we've seen a significant closure over the last 20 years of our landfill facilities, from tens of facilities, maybe 30 facilities by the 2009, 2010, down to now just 3 operational sites. And you can see again where they're actually located in the Eastern Midlands area, very much in the Greater Dublin area. And this is, this is becoming, it is an issue for us in terms of just general waste management, but it's certainly something that construction waste material typically went to these kind of solutions, but it's no longer the case really. So soil recovery capacity. So what do I mean by a soil recovery site? So soil recovery sites, the first thing to say about them is there can be 3 different types of facilities, both a licensed facility, which is kind of a large scale, long-term facility, approved and enforced by the EPA. Typically these facilities would have probably a 10-year lifespan and would take over that lifetime several million tonnes of material. The type of material that they're looking and take in is, for want of a better expression, clean waste. It's essentially your soil waste, uncontaminated material. This is what's going to, and that's what they're suitable for, that's what they're designed for. You can also have these at permitted level, which is a much smaller type facility. It can take over its entire lifespan only 200,000 tonnes. It's authorised by the local authority, enforced by the local authority as well. Very short-term kind of solution, very transient type sites. They can last up for 6 years and they can have a review of their permit, but typically they kind of come and go within those cycles. And then even smaller again is these registered sites that can only take 25,000 tonnes, really only suitable for almost community level local applications. Raising the profile of a GAA pitch or something like that would be ones where you'd see a lot of these applications coming through. So over the last number of years, we've been working in this area. We raised this issue of the lack of soil recovery capacity, firstly in the country, and with all this development going on, where was this material to go to? And certainly there's been improvements in the area in terms of soil recovery, but as you'll see now, it's not particularly well balanced within the country. So all of these sites, what's important is they are all unlined, which means that there is an environmental risk there, which limits the type of material that they can actually accept at the gate. So what this map shows here is just the soil recovery capacity within the Eastern Midlands region, first of all. So you can see on the right-hand side, the authorised facilities. These facilities with their planning permission and with their waste authorisation. You can see it there kind of concentrated around Dublin. What's actually active is quite different. So we've about 4 million tonnes authorised. A number of those sites aren't active at the moment. We've about 2.4 million tonnes that are active. So currently the region is well served. A number of years ago that wasn't the case, but there's certainly been a push. New players have come into the market. They've seen opportunities there. We also see a kind of a new trend now where developers, project developers, both of housing and commercial operations, are looking increasingly at their supply chain and want to secure that supply chain. So are looking at actually moving into these markets, diversifying their activities so that they can control their waste and always have a guaranteed outlet, which wasn't the case a number of years ago. In the southern region, the picture is very different. At the moment, the active capacity you can see is concentrated in both Wexford and Kilkenny, at both, I would say, kind of medium-sized sites. Certainly not the scale of available capacity to construction projects or infrastructure projects compared to the Greater Dublin area. We have, in the authorised sense, we've new facilities due on stream in Cork in this year, one facility in particular. There are two other facilities that are at application stage. But I suppose pressures will start to come on projects because the lack of outlets that are not there and not available to sites to actually move this material to. It means that projects that would be happening in Cork at the moment would be very overly reliant on the smaller sites, the permitted sites and the registered sites. And there isn't the same level of controls and management at these particular sites. The suitability of the material going there, there needs to be evidence-based, tested-based to demonstrate that the material is suitable to go to these particular sites. So recently there's been recommendations about permitted sites that there needs to be a move towards more centralised and larger scale facilities to provide those outlets for projects and development that's happening in the likes of planned in the likes of Cork. If we look here in the Connacht Ulster region, again, a similar kind of story. The situation is actually probably a little bit worse again. They have one facility there that's operational at the moment, has a very small tonnage in there, and its location isn't really close to any of the major urban centres either. So it's just simply not economical to bring the material down. So again, this region will be very overly reliant on both permitted and registered sites. So if we look at the national picture, you can see that there is an imbalance nationally there. We have concentration of facilities around the Greater Dublin area. Currently, okay, the construction levels up there are certainly at a much higher level than they are elsewhere in the country. And, we have a concentration of facilities there, but our major other regional centres, Limerick, Cork, Galway and Waterford, are quite poorly served at the moment. And that's going to increasingly put pressures on projects and project actors within the project cycle to manage their waste and actually where is the material actually going to go. So there's a need for a long-term capacity, both in terms of soil recovery facilities, but also increasingly for those inert landfills. So one of the other areas I wanted to talk to you about is just Indigenous recycling. And this is really to give you an example of one particular operator in the Irish market that we would like to see, I suppose, more development in this kind of manner. So I just took the Gyprock case study. So on sites, for example, Gyprock now have set up a new system where plasterboards from construction sites, they will provide skips directly to those sites. They have a partner with a waste collector who will bring the material, segregated material from those particular sites, bring it into their recycling facility, bring the waste into the processing of the making of new Gyprock materials, new plasterboards, fully traceable, full data management on that. And you can see that there's a continuous loop of the material from use to waste to actually reprocessing into a new product again. And this is the types of solution that increasingly Ireland needs to start developing. There's lots of opportunities out there in different material streams, but we can't continue to kind of operate within the linear model at the moment because quite simply we're not just going to have the outlets for the material. And also this is where the opportunities start actually to arise. There are new business models that people working in this field can actually tap into and actually develop. So on that capacity point, soil recovery capacity is well developed in the Greater Dublin area. There's regional imbalance of long-term capacities. There's a lack of inert facilities to accept inert as non-haz and non-inert waste. Cork, for example, is overly reliant at the moment on smaller facilities, which we would say are transient in nature. They can actually fill up quite quickly after just one particular project. We're looking to develop more indigenous recycling. So particularly on particular streams and fractions of waste, wood and gypsum, we have good examples already operating, but we need a lot more. And we're still reliant on exports in terms of our contaminated materials, metals and plastics. Does anyone have any questions about that, about the soil recovery side of it, or inert landfills and that side of the management of waste materials? So the sector itself, there's been new developments that have actually happened, or new developments in the last year that are worth touching on. So the first area we wanted to talk to you about is end of waste. So as we try and, I suppose, move into a situation where we're looking at, I suppose, new uses for materials. We're no longer seeing our waste as just waste, we're seeing them as resources. There are mechanisms out there that can actually be applied. So end of waste is one, which means that it's simply the point at which a material is no longer a waste. It's now a product. But how does that actual situation arrive? So the material must undergo processing, and that has to happen at a waste authorized facility. And it must comply with specific criteria that are agreed with the EPA. So end of waste is a process that you have to apply to the agency for, requires a lot of evidence work initially up front. The EPA ultimately have to sign off on that and agree with it, and that puts a whole new system in place for it. So the criteria that typically have to apply is that the substance is commonly used for specific purposes, so it has a value to the market. A market or demand exists. The substance fulfills technical requirements for the specific purposes and meets existing legislations and standards applicable to products, because you're now moving the material from a waste to a product, and the use of the substance will not lead to overall adverse environmental or human health impacts. So there are two cases that are worth identifying for the particular sector that have been approved in the last year for end of waste for recycled aggregates. So this is in the first case, at the IMS facility in North Dublin. So the end of waste that's in place there allows concrete coming off sites to be brought to this facility, follow a particular processing system, and actually be the aggregates resulting out of that can then be brought back into the market as a product, no longer as a waste material. So there's a quality assurance system in place there. It must comply with the ISEN 13242 standard, or as transposed here by SR 21. There is a quality management system in place there, so it requires testing, it requires a particular specification, particular processing to be followed, and the use of the material is restricted. It's restricted to road construction in unbound and subbase, capping general fair and pipe bedding, and it's also can be used in bound applications such as concrete or asphalt. So this is something that is very commonly used or very commonly done in European countries. But at the moment in Ireland, this is the first example of where an end of waste criteria has actually gone through the system and been approved. So these particular criteria are specific to that facility. That's important to note as well. So it's only material going to there following the process that particular operator has put into place, agreed with the agency, that actually the recycled aggregate coming out of that can actually be used as a new product. What you'd expect to see now is that more operators will follow this model and actually start developing these solutions at different facilities. The other one that's similar, but it's very specific if you look at the detail of it to a particular application, is that Panda Waste have also received an end of waste criteria. but it's not for just for clean concrete. It's for mixed construction and demolition waste. So they can take in mixed construction and demolition waste, such as concrete bricks and tiles. They can process their material. The contaminants has to be less than 1%. Ultimately, again, it has to follow a particular quality assurance and management system in terms of rigorous criteria, testing, etc. There's factory production controls there. But the use is specifically restricted to the construction of haul roads at the Tara Mines tailing management facility. So there's a clear need, obviously, for aggregates there, but rather than it needs to go through the end of waste criteria in order for the use of that application to happen. So two end of waste solutions in place, but actually two very different scenarios, if you like. One a scenario where this material can actually be used on multiple different construction sites. That's in the IMS case, but in the Panda Waste case, where the material can actually only be used at a specific application. So looking at end of waste and talking about it, it's very much a quality assurance based system where ultimately what we're trying to do is turn waste into a product. In order for that to actually be verified and for it to be safe, it has to meet the standards that are actually in place out there for that product already. Another area of development I mentioned earlier was the byproduct area, and this is something that has been around for a number of years yet, and really there's been a lot of misunderstanding in relation to byproducts in terms of how the system works, what a byproduct is, and how you actually achieve byproduct status. So to give you the actual, I suppose, the statement from the regulation, it's a substance resulting from a production process, the primary aim of which is not the production of that item. It may be regarded as not being a waste if the following conditions are met. So the further use of the material, say, is certain. The material can be used directly without any further processing other than normal industry practice. The substance or object is produced as an integral part of a production process, and further use is lawful, in particular that it will not lead to adverse environmental and human health impacts. So these conditions all have to be achieved and met. And if they're not met, the material fails the byproduct standards. Now, byproducts to date has been most commonly used for soil and stone. And typically maybe the approach has been test material. The material seems okay, seems relatively clean. Therefore, we feel it's good fit for byproducts. Send some information into the EPA. Material could be moved in advance of any kind of correspondence from the agency or any approvals given, any notification given from the agency. So we've had these, I suppose, developments happen in the sector over a number of years, and it's kind of led to a breakdown of the old byproduct approach. So we've had new guidance come in just last year, very clearly stating that there are these conditions to be met and a whole new and a particular process to be followed. So the first thing to say is that the material producer decides that the material is a byproduct. So what that actually means, or who is the material producer? Well, ultimately, it's the client. The client being the public body or the developer. They're in charge of it. It's their project, their site. This isn't just, a byproduct isn't just for contractors on site. It's very much a client-driven process. And in fact, if a contractor wants to actually go down the byproduct route, really can't do it on their own without the client support. And the agency has put in steps that have to be taken to ensure that happens. So every notification is made on a case-by-case basis. You can't just get a byproduct for multiple sites, because all of your destination sites are critical to this particular process as well. So the EPA will either determine that yes, they agree the waste is a byproduct. If that's the case, it falls outside of the waste legislation and doesn't need to be handled normally as waste. If they don't agree with it, that believe it is waste, it remains as waste and must be handled as waste. In terms of the process, in terms of notifying the agency, it's a 10-week process. That's what they're saying at the moment. They'll turn it around and give you the termination on your material. I would say in relation to that 10-week, it really is dependent on the quality of the information that you're going to give to the agency. This is very much an evidence-based process. You have to be able to demonstrate that the material that you have is clean, is suitable. And you also have to be determined that the destination site is also equally suitable and has the appropriate authorizations, be them planning or otherwise, in place to receive the material. So in your application, you have to address all of those criteria. You can't just skip one. Having been through the process recently, every single point we had to address in detail and provide the information to it. The application must be backed up by a declaration. So there are these templates now that the agency have provided. So, for example, if you were a contractor, you felt that the material was useful, you had a third-party site that looked like it was appropriate also, and there was the relevant controls in place. You still can't go off and do that application without the support of the client, who has to actually sign the declaration that they know about this byproduct application and support it. That's really because in the legislation, everyone involved in the process is liable. The client, the handler of the material, the receiving site, they're all involved in it. Things that we've had to submit previously with it is a copy of the planning permission at the existing site. Some of the conditions are there to demonstrate that that site does have the permission to receive material and has a need for it. So that could be defined within the environmental impact assessment that there's a need for an intake of material. So those would mean it might be a good match between the point of generation and the point of receiving the material. Also providing contracts illustrating that the contractor is engaged at this particular site, and also that the receiving site want to take this material, so there might be correspondence between them. All of that ensures that the application is just robust, of the quality necessary, and the agency would then process it. So important, and this is something that's maybe crept into the market, is that an Article 27 about byproduct is an indication that you intend to do something. You can't apply for a byproduct retrospectively, and you can't apply for it as a result of an enforcement notice. So we've come across a situation in a number of cases where we've been on sites and the notification is sent to the agency and the material is moving within a couple of days. So that, if that's followed, there's risks, and the risks have to be understood, that there are risks to the clients, the project, the contractor, because the agency can come back, make a determination, regardless of whether the material has been moved, and find that that's waste. And there has been cases where the material had to be re-excavated back out of the receiving sites. So one of the messages that's come across quite clearly is that byproducts should be thought of right at the planning stage, at the preliminary design stage. We should be thinking about, is there suitable material here? Is there material, are we going to be generating excess material? Is a byproduct application something that we should start considering? So if we're only really considering this at the construction stage, we're putting I suppose it really depends when it's happening, the sequencing of the construction program, but we're certainly giving ourselves, we're putting more pressure in terms of the situation. The earlier we can actually put the information together, okay, it's not always simple in terms of the receiving site and what's available and the sequencing of those sites and the need, etc. But certainly notifying the agency as early as possible to allow them to come back, looking for whatever information they're looking for if it's not suitable initially, just means that it can be planned and scheduled. And the obvious place, I suppose, at this stage is the construction and demolition waste management plan that is prepared pre-planning stage. And that's really where we start identifying the need for byproducts or not. One other area that I suppose relates to all of this, and in particular on the soil recovery side, is waste acceptance criteria. So just one slide, I know there's a lot of information in it, but it's important. It's going to come out this year, and that there are going to be new trigger limits set for soil parameters introduced at licensed, permitted and registered facilities. So those soil recovery sites that I mentioned to you earlier are the waste acceptance criteria. So at those facilities at the moment, for the soil material that they're taken in, they have different parameters within their waste license, and they have different limits set and agreed with the agency. So these are all now going to change. And there's a shift now over to a kind of more geological based solution. So working with the GSI, the EPA and the local authorities, a new system has come up where there's going to be now 7 geological zones within Ireland, and the actual soil trigger limits for each facility are going to be based on the natural occurring material in that particular region. So what that means is that a lot of the facilities, soil recovery sites, all use the WAC, the waste acceptance criteria, and have their limits in there. That's all going to change now. You're going to have specific parameters based on the location of your facility. This may mean that certain waste that you're taking in today, when this comes into place and you've got it agreed with the agency, may no longer be acceptable at that particular site because of the nature and the constituent makeup of the material you're taking in. So this is only really going to complicate things further, put more pressures on the industry. It's also going to put, I suppose, puts up the need, in my view, to actually have more developed of these longer term facilities. So all waste accept will have to be tested for compliance with the new trigger limits. We haven't seen the detail of it. I suppose I'm giving you a foresight of it here. Having just had last week known that this talk was coming up, spoke to some of the people involved in developing it. But it's certainly, I think, it's going to be quite hard to digest for certainly some of the operators out there who've been using the WAC for so long. Industry is very familiar with that. That really is all going to change now. The second point there at the bottom, greenfield material doesn't need to be tested. So, okay, that's, I suppose, there may be an opening there for all materials suddenly to become greenfield to allow it to go in there, but and enforcement, I suppose, is key, like anything here. And just finally, on the other development side, there's new guidance due out this year on the siting of waste management facilities. So one thing that came out of the last regional waste management plans was the lack of guidance around the siting of facilities. And increasingly now, with sites in terms of their location, they're adjacent to European designated sites, environmentally sensitive sites. The location of waste management facility is becoming increasingly more difficult. So this guidance was actually designed to try and put a bit of framework, a bit of structure, and where we want certain sites to go. And soil recovery sites, I think what you're going to see is that these smaller sites are going to go under much more scrutiny now in terms of their suitability of their location. And I would believe it's going to reduce the number of those that are actually going to be in suitable locations. It again pushes more towards the direction of having larger, longer term facilities that are there over 10 plus years to kind of serve the market. I think that would be a consequence of the document. And the other thing to mention is that the construction and demolition guidelines document that you might be familiar with, which was kind of produced in 2006, and that we're all still using at the moment in terms of preparing these C&D waste plans at the planning stage. That's being reviewed and updated at the moment as well. And I suppose it's going to have a different focus on it. It's going to start bringing into the conversation, if you like, end of waste and byproducts. And it means that as clients and engineers working on these projects will be looking and thinking about these issues much earlier on, which can only be a good thing, but it's certainly going to take a little bit of training to actually get up to speed with the new approach that's going to be within that. So just really the last section of the talk was really on the future path of direction. So where I've tried to outline to you that the numbers behind in terms of C&D waste, it's certainly something that we expect to grow. I've tried to outline what's in the market at the moment in terms of handling, construction and demolition waste, and then really to focus in on some of the key changes. And they do represent opportunities as well, so end of waste and byproducts. If you're thinking about byproducts early enough, it means that you might be able to find a suitable site, and there might be good synergies there between moving material and finding a good destination site that's appropriate for it. So for an example, on Dublin Metro North, where they're expected to generate over 3 million tonnes of soil and stone, that process as well and train even before planning permission has been granted. So, but the future path of direction is very much, it's within the climate agenda, the sustainable development agenda. And I suppose we're getting increasingly more familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is set out a kind of a 15-year path for, I suppose, more sustainable living globally. But this is all now, you can see all of the local authorities, the public bodies in Ireland have all embraced this. They're all wearing the badge within it. It's very much, part of the day-to-day thinking within the policy body of Ireland. So one of the key goals is Number 12, responsible consumption and production. And that has targets like sustainable management and use of natural, let's just say, resources, substantially reduce waste generation, encourage companies to adopt sustainable practice and sustainable reporting, promote sustainable public procurement. So what we're going to see increasingly on projects, certainly in public sector clients, is a move towards embedding sustainability within the project right from the earliest stages. And this whole agenda has been followed up by the European Commission. They've moved and put in place a circular economy action plan, which is within the climate action plan as well. And circular economy is simply what it's saying. It's moving from linear models of take, make, and dispose into more resource-based solutions. So we're looking at our materials. They are resources. We're not seeing them as waste. How can we extend the life of them? How can we make sure that the secondary life is as valuable as the primary life as well? So one of the priority sectors is construction and demolition waste for that new approach. And the current situation is that across Europe, we have kind of basic levels of recycling and recovery. So backfilling as a solution, putting our material for land restoration and soil recovery capacity, is quite low grade levels. And the European Commission has identified this. What they're trying to push is that we get more higher grade solutions. So moving away from open loop recycling into closed loop. So where materials are going back into the system, the resources are being reused into new products, and continue that cycle along. So in terms of the construction sector, what does that mean? Better management of our resources. Okay, that sounds all good. Prevention instead of management. So the idea of designing out waste. So how are we going to actually start doing that on projects? What are the steps that we need to do to start looking at this particular issue, rather than waste just being something that we manage at the end of the process? How do we start developing our systems, developing our processes, developing how we deliver projects, so that we're thinking about these things all the way through the life cycle, and we're trying to minimize out the impact on the environment ultimately at the end. So it's circular management instead of linear management, and then ultimately, as a result of reducing our waste, having less pressure on land and facilities to dispose of this material. And the types of things that I believe are going to start coming in increasingly within the sector is that, okay, we're going to have to start thinking sustainably right from the start of our project. So typically you see in the project life cycle, we start with the feasibility stage. We're going to have to start thinking about the sustainability of projects right from the start as well. All aspects of the projects, how the project's built, the actual sustainable, the options that we're actually choosing, and looking at those right from the start of the particular project life cycle. The client is actually key to influencer. So clients increasingly, the onus on them will be to set sustainability targets and frameworks for projects. What is it that we're trying to achieve? What is the benchmark? These might come across in performance rating systems, etc. But increasingly the client becomes a key influencer in driving this agenda through projects. Because what we see is that when projects get into delivery mode and get down a particular track of development, it's very hard to actually start trying to embed sustainable principles when it's well through the development's life cycle. The role of green public procurement is going to be an increasingly important lever in terms of when we get to that stage of ensuring that we have the right sustainable criteria. They're included within the procurement and the contract documents, and that they are set to actually achieve sustainable outcomes. So at the moment, we're not really encountering this both at the consultant stage, really at the construction stage. It's minimal at the moment. But that is going to change. It has to change because it's such a powerful lever in terms of actually trying to deliver in building the infrastructure what we're trying to achieve. As designers, in terms of designing it out, we need to, I suppose, increasingly be thinking about the project, not only through the design, planning stage, into procurement, into construction and the life cycle, but actually we need to be starting thinking about, in particular in the built environment, about the demolition and the disassembly of buildings. And is our designs facilitating selective demolition? Or is it that is the materials that we use, are they composite materials, are the materials that we can actually have a secondary purpose within them? What is the recycled content of them? Are they fit for future recycling or future reuse? So designing for disassembly is going to have to increasingly become important and understanding demolition processes. The actors that are along that chain, very much engineers, the clients, architects, contractors. I think increasingly we need to understand the role that we play as engineers and the influence that we have on the different stages of the project life cycle to try and achieve more sustainable outcomes, lower environmental impact, better management of our materials ultimately. And some of the other future actions that we're going to, I think, believe we'll see is increasingly financial incentives or economic instruments to support secondary materials and recycled materials. So we do have levies on virgin tax in other member states, and these types of things are going to be looked at in Ireland, certainly. If we want to actually move away from extraction and continued use of virgin material, these are instruments that we have to look at the moment so that we start to, I suppose, balance the pricing to favour these more greener solutions. Certainly the standards for secondary materials, recycled products with high recyclable content have to be improved and have to be in place there. There are concerns over quality, durability of material. That needs to be addressed. We need to put those in place. End of waste criteria is certainly a step in the right direction, but it needs to be built on, and we're only at the beginning of that. Things like BIM in terms of logging and tracking materials within assets so that we, I suppose, have a compositional breakdown of materials in terms of what are the elements within there, what is the makeup of those particular elements, can they be refurbished, can they be reused, how are they put in. So I suppose BIM, the digitalization of the construction sector, offers an opportunity for us to do that, and we need to embrace that so that ultimately we're making it easier into the future for these materials to be reused. And it might sound very, lofty in that sense, but there are already these projects happening across Europe using technology in this way, and it's certainly something that we need to catch up on and embrace. And then simple things like at the construction side, increased off-site and prefabrication structures, helping to minimize material use and minimize waste, is increasingly something that we're going to see to try and minimize the impact that we have from a particular projects. So thank you for that, and happy to take any questions that you have.
Thanks very much, Warren. Does anyone have any questions? Two hands up there. Ladies first.
The IMF, the Article 58, was that specific to a contract that they got the material, so, for compaction in a trench, or was that specific to a certain client that they did that for, to their standards, or was the standard overall that they got?
No, so they're the first operator who has the end of waste specific to their facility. So they have invested in a new processing kit to allow them to achieve the end of waste standards that are within the authorization that the EPA have met, and to meet the SR21 requirements. So they're not tied to a specific project or a particular material intake. They have controls around the intake. So their concrete has to be clean. There's certain requirements in terms of the contamination of that material, that it has to go through a certain level of processing, take out any steel, etc., what's in there. And they would also be targeting, they would look in advance at particular sites whether they felt the concrete material coming off that was suitable or not. Yeah. But their end of waste criteria is general to the market. Okay. So you can be talking to them in advance about the demolition of your project, this concrete waste that we have, and whether it's suitable to go there or not. And that then, you can see kind of how loops will start to happen there. You can have a contractor have his concrete waste and send it to them. They'll turn it into a new product. He could reuse it again, and it starts to be, I suppose, self-serving in that sense.
Yeah, so that doesn't have to be a certain standard for, just an example, not concrete, but if you were, I suppose, I would work with a contractor with a lot of maintenance and stuff outside.
Yeah.
We see it as like a massive cost, first of all.
Yeah.
It's not having to become something that we're using, but it's finished, it's classified as a waste and you can't use it.
Yeah, so on the planings, it's worth it maybe just adding to that is that, and I probably should have mentioned that earlier, so there is work I would say, progressing with the road planings at the moment. So what Ireland is trying to do is put into place a national criteria for road planing. So it won't be, see, ideally what you want is these kind of national criteria that any facility could then adopt and then put them into place and put the system and approve for it. But the EPA have been quite slow in trying to deliver that end of voice criteria. And what we had with IMS was coming out as an operator to offer a competitive advantage in the market and develop their own criteria. What's happening with the road planings is the waste management regional offices are taking the lead on that, and they're looking to establish national criteria for road planings so that operators could actually adopt those and apply them then at the facilities. But it is important to note that, you know, once you start getting into end of waste, you do have to have a waste authorization at your site. You can't just start processing without that. End of waste requires a license or a permit. You know, if you have a license, you're going to be enforced by the EPA. You can have a permit, and that would mean a local authority enforcement regime. But there is a difference there. You know, you can't just adopt that, start processing it. You are going to be within certain controls and you know, regulatory controls.
And they're very compliant with the standards that they would have. You know, so you just all this money on this process, and then you go to, for example, our phone, and you're like, no, we're not using it because it's not meeting standards that we have for our pipeline and our reinstatement.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, at the moment, like when you look across Europe, what they do in terms of just to reuse it, they consider at the moment in Europe low-grade stuff that we're not even doing yet in terms of reusing recycled aggregates and all these different applications that you're mentioning there. They've been doing that for 20 years. They're trying to move it up the process chain, and we're only beginning at this process. And we have to get more certainty and belief in these materials. And I would hope that end of waste, because the whole quality assurance system is based on the product system for this, if it was virgin material, demonstrate that the material is comparable. It would also be marketed in the same way and branded with the CE certification as well. So yeah, the switch has to happen at the client level, at the engineering level. We should be specifying the material and encouraging that. It should then translate into the procurement and the contract documents so that it actually follows through. So it is there, it is within SR21, it is there, but we're just not seeing it come through on the projects. You know, the drive isn't there. And this is what I'm talking about, clients setting these kind of sustainable targets within their own contracts to say, no, that we want this quantum of material to be recycled within the project, you know.
Is there a question there?
Question on your other example for the end of waste case there.
Yeah.
In the panel of waste, you mentioned, sorry, you didn't specify this when you were speaking, but your text mentioned that the material or the product in that case was okay for use in temporary harbors.
That's the application that they applied for, yes.
But did it look ahead to me, would there be temporary harbors? Does that presume that the harbors need to be removed and what happens to them when they are removed, or is it not temporary? Do you not mean that literally? So, you know, the report of the harbors is temporary, but the harbors want to be left there, or is the material removed from the harbors at the end of the construction phase?
No, it wouldn't be removed because it's gone through the process. It's now a product.
Okay,
So
the harbors are not to be removed then?
well, that's what I'm assuming. Yeah, that they've gone through this process. They obviously a substantial need and substantial quantity of material. Like I don't know the specifics on that particular site, but I wouldn't say it's been removed. No.
No, because in theory, what I mean, we don't have to think about putting in all those to get it ready to
Right.
do what we need to do. And
Yeah.
there is a question about can we leave the hollow there or not. And very often if the level is agreeable and so on,
Right.
that's fine.
Okay.
But it's not automatically assumed that our temporary hollow can stay there.
Right.
So
Okay.
it could well be the case that the temporary hollow might be true at this point.
Yeah, I wouldn't be 100% certain on it, but that's what I believe to be.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Just a question on the soil and stone byproducts.
Yes.
I suppose, are you talking about general excavated material there?
Yes.
And if you are, what's the benefit of classifying it as a byproduct rather than sending it to permitted or registered facilities?
Yes. So the byproducts allows both greenfield material or brownfield material. I mean, the evidence, the burden of evidence then obviously increases with the material that, you know, is not from a greenfield site. I suppose the advantage is environmental, but it's also substantially economic. If you have hundreds of thousands of this material, you have a potentially significant saving. That currently in Dublin, the price at the gate for soil recovery is probably around €6.50. It was about €5 about 2 years ago, so it's substantially increasing. You know, so it is a cost to the project, to the contractor, to the client.
So are these destination sites effectively new tips then?
So these destination sites, so having been through one recently, we had in Adamstown, in South County Dublin, we had some works being done on a housing development, and then an opportunity to send it to 2 destination sites. One was a park development and one was another housing development where they had a need for material. The need for material was specified at both destination sites, the need to take intake material. So one of the things that hasn't happened and needs to happen a lot clearer is that when we're actually talking about destination sites and being explicit about the need for the intake material, that will create the destination sites and a market for those.
So if that in that case, then at planning stage, would you need to potentially flag your development as a destination site?
We have an explicit need for the intake of this material. I think we were able to go to the environmental impact assessment or an environmental report, extract certain things or append it to the and it makes it very easy for the agency then to sign that through within the 10 weeks. And then you know, you have 12,000 tons or 20,000 tons of material not costing, you know, €150,000. It's now just going to a destination site down the road. So it can work very well, but it's the planning, it's the sequencing, you know, things have to fall into place. But what I would see is that once it starts to come through the system and people get familiar with it, they'll get more confidence in it, more belief in it, and clients will start to see it as a real advantage to improve both sustainability and to deliver cost savings in their projects, you know.
Should the EPA be enforced a bit more strongly with the client when it comes to contractor? We make plans for pipeline to put in with one small facility in town.
Yeah.
And they're scratching their heads on how they want to do that for enforcement.
Yeah, I think actually the issue with the clients is it's not necessarily the EPA's responsibility. It's sometimes it's just the lack of knowledge and awareness of what this mechanism that's there, and the missed opportunities that can happen if they're not thinking about it early enough. So often the issues have come up with the contractor saying we might be able to move this elsewhere, and that's valid. But what we need is a much more joined up thinking throughout the process. That, you know, that there's an early flag on this material. We can see that there's clear opportunities, and that the client and the client side team end up working with the contractor to find the solution for it, you know. So the awareness of byproducts, end of waste, this new waste acceptance criteria, which is going to cause, I believe, a lot of headaches for sites because it rewrites all of the rules in terms of waste acceptance criteria. The material that's in the ground is ultimately going to be exempt, but when the first draft of the guidance came out, that wasn't going to be exempt. So it just really wasn't being understood properly. So, but it is going to change the makeup of where you can send materials. Now, I know this material is heavy. There's only probably a certain distance you're going to send it anyway before it becomes economical. But, you know, you could be close to your project could be buffering on 2 different regions. And it could be suitable in one and not suitable in another. And this is the things we're all going to have to get our head around, you know.
Is there, or would there be a benefit to having a central database, for example, like the last few questions was like if you're generating waste, that potentially is of use to someone else.
Yeah.
But if you don't know that someone else, or there might be use of projects that you're aware of, that
yes,
that be like,
absolutely. I think
like
that is. I agree.
Register your waste.
Yeah.
Potentially that is a resource.
I think that's right. There needs to be registered because, you know, these sites shouldn't be hidden away. We should have a way, a platform where there's availability. This site is there. This is when they expect them to go to construction. This is when the need of material is. This is the quantum of material that they need. Simple kind of stuff. It allows for this mechanism to actually happen then, you know, and it brings material out of the waste legislation, the waste environment, and it's no longer waste and it's easier to use. So we're using it as a resource, which is better in a sense. So I agree with that, yeah, totally.
What was the logic of switching from the WAC, which had been there for a long time, and
Yeah.
the purity protect the environment, to go for this soils type
Yeah.
criteria?
Well, it probably goes back now 20 years, and what happened was Ireland just adopted the WAC because we didn't have anything else. We didn't have soil standards in the country, so we adapted the waste acceptance criteria, which came from the landfill directive, and ultimately that was all about sending material to landfill. And landfills at the bottom level have a liner, so you've a clay liner and an inert landfill, you've a geotextile and a municipal, and a hazardous, you've got double liners. So it was designed around those destinations. It was never intended for use the way we've used it. It was actually never intended for that. So we adopted this system that was designed for landfills, and we applied it to sites which are unlined and are exposed to, infiltration material, groundwater contamination, surface water contamination, connectivity to environmental sites. That's where the risk is. And we've done a poor job in managing this, and the agency have probably known about it for an awful long time, but it hasn't been addressed. So the WAC, yes, it was used because there was nothing else, and that's what we used. And it became very commonplace. It was known as the Murphy Suite, for a long time for people, and we were placing this material in the ground. But it's not appropriate anymore. But to me, it's just taken so long to develop it there that it's going to be quite frustrating now for, I think, everyone in the market.
So it is for permitted sites.
It won't be used like all of those sites I'm describing, the registered, the permitted, and the licensed sites. The WAC won't be applied to any of those anymore.
So the new criteria will be used for permitted sites, but not for the inert sites, the licensed sites.
So yes, WAC can be used for inert and municipal sites, yes, where they're lined, yes.
And the new criteria for permitted, which are unlined sites.
Exactly. So it's specific to those soil recovery sites which are unlined, yes, yeah.
Okay, check one more.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a supplementary question to the question that the gentleman over there asked you about designate your proposed construction site as a destination site.
Yes.
Kind of at the planning stage, if you want to use it on the soil, say, in your construction material.
Yes.
That sounds great, but do you also have to have a source site to go along with that at your planning stage? Or can you say, my site is going to be a destination site for suitable soil that's taken from other sites, where you wouldn't be in a position to identify the source site at that point?
No, yes, you don't need to have, say, it all figured out at that point. I suppose if you're at the destination site, what you're saying is, okay, we have a need for this amount of material intake.
Yes.
That goes into the environmental impact assessment report or the planning report.
Yeah.
It's ultimately approved.
Yeah.
What that means is that your site now has the potential to take this material in.
Yeah.
And if there's a destination or a point of generation that they're going to have all this material there, there's the solution then starts to come together.
You have the option then at the construction stage to say, well, actually, there's development happening over there, they
Yeah.
get material, I can use that material to comply with my requirements.
Absolutely, and what you want then is conversations to be happening earlier in that, and this is where conversations and networking in the market and all of that it's going to have to start improving, so that there is that dialogue happening generally around between contractors and between sites. So for example, it's why, for example, on Dublin Metro they're already talking about the 3 million. Where could they put the 3 million? So it's now out there, which is a good thing, because they're going to generate this amount of material. It's going to be good material, but in order for this to be able to move this, so that there isn't a phenomenal cost going to be on the project if they have to actually put this at waste facilities, they need to put that out there very early on to see where the destinations might be, and then go through the process for every destination site. That's important. Your point of generation with all these different destination sites, they would all be separate byproduct applications.
But having your site designated as a destination site would be advantageous.
Exactly, and it wouldn't be. There's no designation as such. It's just you identifying the need within your application documents. Yeah.
So it's merely an argument for requiring that a yes or no answer as part of the planning process.
Yeah.
Does your site
need that? Let's be thinking about that. And make sure it's articulated and documented within the documents.
Yeah. Do you know anything that can be done with crushed concrete presently in Cork other than to send it to licensed site?
In Cork, well, I mean, there was a lot of issues over the last number of years in terms of even simple things like, you know, the use of crushed concrete and piling mats and that, you know, are you talking about situations like that?
Yeah, I'm talking about the current guidelines, there's cross concrete and power.
Yes.
Do you know anything you can do with the public, I want to tell you a question, that you can do with the other than sending it to the licensed facility in your own country?
At the moment, yeah, that's the situation, yeah. Because there is no end of waste processing point. There's nowhere that's turning that waste into a product that I know of. I know.
Even though it needs like to get tested, it needs engineering, it's material, is that if you test it, it's enough. If you know, if you test it, it's perfectly good for all to be used.
Absolutely, and look, this is the problem. And this is the arguments that have been kind of circular arguments that have been going around for a long time, and it's why the lack of progress on a national end of waste criteria has been a major barrier for this. At one point, I think there was nearly 1 million tons of recycled ag sitting on a major operator's site in the Greater Dublin area because there was nowhere to put the material. There was no market for the material, so we haven't created this market yet, and it really is holding up the industry. And you know, I believe there's an awful lot of innovative people within the industry who look for these solutions, and it just has been stagnant for an awful long time. So getting that first one through, I think was with IMS in particular, it's a turning point, but we need to see a lot more of it. And if they're national criteria, that's where we'd like to be at instead of just facility based, which is really just one operator. But they've taken a lead, and you know it's positive to see that, but. We've a long way to catch up with, you know, the way things are happening in, say, the Netherlands or Germany, the way they actually use end of waste properly. You know, so in Cork, I don't know of a facility where that would be allowed.
Even if the material meets all of the, you know, 4 or 5 criteria to be a byproduct, not be a waste. All of them, you know, points there.
Well, sorry, using it as a byproduct, that's a possibility. Yes, if you can show that you meet the criteria that are applied there, and the destination site is suitable, and you can show the various, I suppose, the need at the destination site, and there will be no adverse environmental impacts as well. I haven't come across yet personally one successful application. So the story about byproducts over the last number of years has been the extent of unsuccessful applications. It's typically at 99% unsuccessful. And a lot of that, just important thing to remember, is just the quality of the application. Is you know, if you put in a quality application, you are going to save yourself an awful lot of time. So what the EPA were constantly reporting back is that they were getting single pages of information and not enough detail. And if there's not enough detail there, they're not going to approve it, and it's not going to give determination. So that is something to focus on. And I think, as I said, you go through the process one, make sure you're addressing all the various criteria, put more information in than less, put together a good application. And I think that's half the battle in terms of getting, you know, if you've picked out the right destination site, I think you'll be well on way to getting it over the line.
No further questions, and thank you very much, Mark. Just as you're talking there, I was just minded to recall, I think the last time Cork Region had a night lecture on construction demolition waste was 2005, I think. And I think you put up a chart at the very start there showing that the peak of the waste generation was 2007, 17.9 million tons being generated. And we all know what happened shortly thereafter. I suppose now we're at 5 billion tons and hoping to go to 10 over the next 10 years. So it's just a picture of the Cork Region's having a lecture on CFD waste. And hopefully we've learned from the lessons of the past there. Also, the other point that came to mind was the how legislation has changed since that lecture back in 2009 or 2005, where Article 27 now, and that was 2011 directive or regulations, and we have, I suppose, more awareness in terms of environmental sustainability, and the whole, I suppose, the circular economy is now on the agenda, whereas it wasn't part of the conversation 15 years ago at all here. So there have been a lot of changes. And the third point that came to mind was in relation to the lack of availability of destination sites for any waste that is generated within the construction industry. So it's an onus on us as professionals, I suppose, to come up with solutions that don't generate waste, because our projects won't proceed because there's nowhere to get rid of that waste. Particularly in the Cork region, there's probably slightly more availability in the Dublin region, but we're certainly very constrained here. So in terms of growth of the construction industry in the region, there are challenges there that we're I suppose that we'll have to come up with solutions to address over the next short while if the economy is going to keep growing the way it needs to. So thank you very much for your presentation, your time for coming down to talk to us, and your comprehensive answers to our questions. I just call on Ronan Keane now, Vice Chairman of the Cork Region, just to give you a little token of our appreciation.
Talking. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ron.
Absolutely.
Cheers.
This is fantastic. So